everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Soumya. In my last video, I had uploaded the GCP Associate Cloud Engineer Practice Test Module 1 which contained 20 set of questions. So in today's video, I'll be doing this Module 2 and this contains another set of 20 questions with detailed explanation. So let's get started. Your QA team has provided a sign-off to deploy a new application in a new production environment. The application will be deployed on a compute engine instance on a new GCP project that is not created yet. What shall you do? So these are the options available. And the correct answer is option A. Use the Cloud SDK to create a new project. Enable the compute engine API in that project. Create the instance specifying your new project. Option A is the correct answer. Use the Cloud SDK to create a new project. Enable the compute engine API in that project. Create the instance specifying your new project. So now let's take a look at each of these options. So let's take a look at option B. Use the Cloud Console to enable compute engine API. You have to enable the compute engine API. Next, use the Cloud SDK to create an instance. Use the project flag to specify a new project. So this option is incorrect because we don't specify project flag to create a new project. So the command itself is wrong. So this option is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option C. Use the Cloud SDK to create a new instance. Use the project flag to specify the new project. When Cloud SDK prompts you to enable the compute engine API, answer yes. Even this option is not correct because we will not be using this project flag to create a new project. Now let's take a look at option D. Use the Cloud Console to enable Compute Engine API. Navigate to the Compute Engine section of the console and create a new instance. Look for the Create in a New Project option in the creation form. Since we have not yet created a new project, this option doesn't seem correct. There is no Look for the Create in a New Project option in the creation form. So this option is not available because you need to create a new project first. So option D is incorrect. So now let's take a look at option A. Use the Cloud SDK to create a new project. Enable the Compute Engine API in that project. Create the instance specifying your new project. So option A is correct because first we need to create a new project. As in the question they state that GCP project is not yet created. So first we need to create a new project. Once a project is created, we need to enable the Compute Engine API because this API is very important to create an instance. So before creating an instance, you need to enable the Compute Engine API. So once the API is enabled, you will next go ahead with creating the instance specifying your new project. So option A is the correct one for this scenario. Now let's move ahead with the question 22. The production environment of your cryptocurrency trading website is going through an external security audit. The organization policy called domain restricted sharing is applied on the organization node, preventing users other than the organization's cloud identity domain from gaining access to the GCP organization. The auditor needs to review the resources in the project but not edit anything. How can you enable this access? So these are the available options. And the correct answer is option C. Create a temporary account for the auditor in Cloud Identity. Give that account the viewer role on the project. Now, let's take a look at each of these options and try to understand why this option C is correct while rest of the options are not correct. Now, let's take a look at option A. Give the auditor's Google account the viewer role on the project. As per the domain restriction policy, it will not allow the auditor to use their own personal Google account to access the project. So there will be a restriction. Auditor will not be able to use his own Google account to view the project. So option A is incorrect. Let's take a look at option B. Give the auditor's Google account the security reviewer role on the project. So again here they are specifying to use the auditor's Google account, but as per the domain restriction policy, it will not let anyone use their personal account to view the project. So this option is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option D. Create a temporary account for the auditor in Cloud Identity. Give that account the security reviewer role on the project. This option is incorrect because here it suggests to create a temporary account. But this temporary account is given the security reviewer role. By assigning the security reviewer role, we are giving extra permission to this auditor, which is not the best practice. So auditor just need to view the resources in the project but not edit anything. But providing security reviewer role is not the best solution for this scenario. So this should be avoided as per the best practices. Now let's take a look at option C. Create a temporary account for the auditor in Cloud Identity. Give that account the viewer role on the project. Option C is correct because the organization has to create a new account for the auditor in their domain and provide that auditor the viewer role to view all the resources. So this option is correct, and with this permission the auditor will be able to view the resources in the project and perform the auditing. So option C is the best solution for this scenario. Now let's move ahead with the question 23. Your company runs multiple websites on different GCP projects for selling groceries, medicines, liquor, etc. Your security team is developing an anomaly detection tool that will be used to analyze all logs from all projects over the last 60 days. To facilitate the development of the tool, you need to enable the security team to quickly explore and analyze the log contents. What is the Google recommended practice to obtain combined logs of all projects? So these are the options available. And the correct answer is option B. Export the logs using a Stackdriver logging export with a sync destination to a BigQuery dataset. Configure the table expiration to 60 days. Now let's take a look at each of this option and understand why option B is correct and other options are not correct. Let's take a look at option A. Select resource labels project ID equals star in Stackdriver logging. This option is incorrect because you cannot view logs of multiple projects at the same time in Stackdriver logging. So this option is not available. Now let's take a look at option C. Export the logs using a Stackdriver logging export with a sync destination to cloud storage. Create a lifecycle rule to delete objects after 60 days. This option is not correct because here it states the sync destination is set to cloud storage and the cloud storage does not allow performing analysis on the logs. So this option is not available. So option C is not correct. Now let's proceed with option D. Read from Stackdriver and store the logs in BigQuery using a cloud scheduler job. Configure the table expiration to 60 days. Here, cloud scheduler job is not required. Option D suggests to use a cloud scheduler job. We don't have to create a cloud scheduler job for this. Here in the question, it states that to facilitate the development of the tool, you need to enable the security team to quickly explore and analyze the log contents. So for this purpose, we can take a look at option B. Export the logs using a Stackdriver logging export with a sync destination to a BigQuery dataset and configure the table expiration to 60 days. So this is the correct option because using BigQuery we can perform analysis on logs and this will be the quickest solution for this scenario. And since here the security team is developing an anomaly detection tool that will be used to analyze all logs from all projects over the last 60 days. So here we will make use of this configure the table expiration to 60 days and we will export the log using a Stackdriver logging export to a BigQuery dataset, and using a BigQuery we can analyze all these logs. So this is the best solution for this scenario. Now let's move ahead with the question 24. You are responsible for maintaining all service accounts for your logistics application that is distributed over multiple projects. Some activity data is stored in a BigQuery dataset in the M databases app projects. So this is a project name and it needs to be accessed by VMs in a web applications project. How can you enable this access to service accounts using Google's recommended practice? And these are the available options. And the correct answer is option D. Grant BigQuery data viewer role to M databases app and appropriate roles to web application. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Option A. Grant project owner for web applications appropriate roles to M databases app. So option A suggests to grant project owner for web application. Here IAM roles are given to users and service accounts and not to the project. So option A is not correct. Let's take a look at option B. Grant project owner role to M databases app and the web application project. And here granting project owner is too broad. So granting project owner permission is not required for this scenario. and also we don't grant permissions at the project level. So option B is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option C, grant project owner role to M databases app and BigQuery data viewer role to web application. Here option C is incorrect because granting project owner role to EM databases project is unnecessary and it will potentially add risk. Therefore, this option is not the best choice. Now let's take a look at option D. Grant BigQuery data viewer role to M databases app and appropriate roles to web applications. So this option is correct because since the web app needs access to the BigQuery datasets, we have to give access to the web app, the data viewer role, to only read the datasets. By doing so, the service account in the web application project will have read-only access to the BigQuery datasets. So we are also adding appropriate roles to the web application. This approach follows the principle of least privilege and provides the necessary access to accomplish this task. So option D is correct for this scenario. Now let's move ahead with the question 25. You have created a UI on the App Engine that queries BigQuery and aggregates the data to create beautiful visualizations. The application uses the default App Engine service account. The BigQuery dataset is managed by another team in a different GCP project. You don't need access to the GCP project, but your app needs to create the visualizations by reading the data from BigQuery. What should you do? So these are the options available. And the correct answer is option B. Ask the other team to grant the BigQuery data viewer role to your default App Engine service account. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Let's take a look at option A. Ask the other team to grant the BigQuery job user role to your default App Engine service account. So this option is incorrect because the BigQuery job user role provides permission to run jobs, including queries, within the project. It is not suitable to read data. But in the question it states that app needs to create the visualizations by reading the data from BigQuery. Option A is not correct. Since the BigQuery job user role provides permissions to run jobs and it is not suitable to read data. Now let's take a look at option C. Provide the default App Engine service account with the role of BigQuery data viewer in your GCP project. Here option C is incorrect because the data is in another project and hence the role needs to be given in the other project and not in the current project. So option C is not correct for this scenario. Now let's check the option D. Provide the role of BigQuery job user in your project to a newly created service account from the other team. Even this option is not correct because the data is in another project and role needs to be given in the other project and not in the current project. So even this option is not correct. Let's take a look at option B. Ask the other team to grant the BigQuery data viewer role to your default App Engine service account. So this option is correct because the BigQuery data viewer role will allow users to read data and metadata from the table or the view. So by providing data viewer rule to the default App Engine service account, it will be able to read the data from BigQuery and create a visualization as per this scenario. So option B is correct. Now let's move ahead with the question 26. You have designed a PDF processing application that uses multiple GCP products. Your company's finance team has asked you to provide them with an estimate of the monthly cost of running the application. What should you do? So these are the options available. And the correct answer is option A. Find out the pricing for each product in the solution by visiting its pricing page. Use the pricing calculator to find out the total monthly cost for each Google Cloud product. Now let's take a look at each of these options and understand why option A is correct and not the others. Now let's take a look at option B. Find out the pricing for each product in the solution by visiting its pricing page. Create a Google Sheet that summarizes the expected monthly cost for each product. Option B is incorrect because there is no need to create a Google Sheet since we already have a ready tool available for pricing calculation, and also prices of cloud services change with time. So this option is not correct. Now let's take a look at option C. Provision the solution in Google Cloud for 1 week. Visit the billing report page in the Cloud Console. Multiply the 1 week cost to determine the monthly cost. Option C is incorrect because only to calculate the pricing of the resources, there is no need to provision the infrastructure. This option is not the correct one. So let's check the option D. Provision the solution on Google Cloud for 1 week. Use cloud monitoring to determine the provision and use resource amounts. Multiply the 1 week cost to determine the monthly cost. Even this is a tedious process and there is no need to keep the infrastructure provision just to calculate the price. Option B, C and D are not correct. Now let's check the option A. Find out the pricing for each product in the solution by visiting its pricing page. Use a pricing calculator to find out the total monthly cost for each Google Cloud product. So this option is the best solution for this scenario since the pricing calculator is the fastest and it also provides an accurate way to calculate pricing for the GCP. So option A is correct. Now let's move ahead with the question 27. You have recently joined the security team at a big enterprise. Your first task is to inspect who has the project owner role in a certain GCP project. What should you do? So these are the options available and the correct answer is option D. View the current role assignments by running the command gcloud projects get IAM policy. Now let's take a look at each of this option. Let's check option A. Go to the Google Cloud Console and validate which SSH keys are stored as project-wide keys. This option is incorrect because SSH keys and IAM rules have no connection between them. Now let's take a look at option B. Navigate to Identity Aware Proxy and check who has permission for these resources. Identity Aware Proxy and the project owner rules are two different types of rules. So this option is not the correct one. Let's check option C. Enable audit logs on the IAM and admin page for all resources and validate the results. This option is not correct because the requirement is to see who currently has the owner role and audit logs will show only the historical data. So option C is incorrect. Now let's check option D. View the current role assignments by running the command gcloud projects get IAM policy. Option D is correct because viewing the role assignments in the command line is the fastest and easiest way to check who has which role. Now let's proceed with question 28. You work as a site reliability engineer in a firm with multiple GCP projects. You are building a customer facing website on Compute Engine. Your GCP project is used by other teams to host their apps as well. How can you prevent other teams from accidentally causing downtime to your application? So these are the options available. And the correct answer is option D, enable deletion protection on the instance. Now let's take a look at each of this option. Let's take a look at option A, use a shielded VM. Using a shielded VM does not prevent the instance to be deleted. Now let's check option B, use a preemptible VM. This option is not correct because preemptible VM may be shut down at any time and it can cause downtime. Here we have to ensure that we prevent other teams from accidentally causing downtime to the application. So both of these options are not correct. Now let's take a look at option C, use a sole tenant node. Using a sole tenant node does not prevent the instance to be deleted. Now let's take a look at option D, enable deletion protection on the instance. So by enabling this option, we can protect VM instances from deleting by setting the deletion protection property on an instance resource. By setting this option, we can prevent other team members accidentally deleting the instances, which might lead to the application downtime. So this option is the correct one. Now let's proceed with the question 29. One of your key employees received a job offer from another cloud company. He or she left the organization without giving notice. His Google account was kept active for 3 weeks. How can you find out if the employee accessed any sensitive data after he or she left? So these are the options available. And the correct answer is option C. Visit cloud logging to view data access audit logs. Search for the user's email as the principal. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Option A, visit cloud logging to view system event logs. Search for the user's email as the principal. Here, system event logs do not provide data access related information. So it provides only logs specific to the system, whereas we need logs specific to the user. So option A is not correct. Now let's take a look at option B. Visit cloud logging to view system event log. search for the service account associated with the user. Again, with this system event logs, we will not be able to fetch the details specific to that user, whether that employee has accessed any sensitive data. So option A and B are not correct. Now let's take a look at option D. Visit cloud logging to view admin activity logs. Search for the service account associated with the user. Here, admin activity logs will not provide data access related information. It just provides admin related activity logs. Getting these admin activity logs will be of no use to determine whether that employee has accessed the sensitive data or not. So option D is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option C. Visit cloud logging to view data access audit logs. Search for the user's email as the principal. So this option is correct because the data access logs will show if the user has tried to access any sensitive data. So with these logs, we can determine if the employee had accessed any sensitive data before leaving the company. So option C is the correct answer for this scenario. Now let's proceed with question 30. You are a software engineer at a startup. You have built an image search API service that is used by users from all over the world. The application receives SSL encrypted TCP traffic on port 443. Which load balancing option should you use to minimize latency for the clients? So these are the options available, and the correct answer is SSL proxy load balancer. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Option A, HTTPS load balancer. This option is incorrect because in the question they have not mentioned about HTTPS on 443. Here the application is receiving SSL encrypted TCP traffic on port 443. So we will not be able to use this HTTPS load balancer for this scenario. Now let's take a look at option B, network load balancer. Since a network load balancer is a generic type, we will not be able to use this as well. Now let's take a look at option D, internal TCP UDP load balancer. Option D is incorrect because we need external traffic and the internal load balancer is used for internal traffic. Since this is an image search API service that is used by users from all over the world, it has to be made available. So in this scenario, we have to make use of external load balancer. And since it is receiving external traffic, we will not be able to use this internal TCP UDP load balancer. Now let's take a look at option C, SSL proxy load balancer. This option is correct because SSL proxy load balancing is a reverse proxy load balancer that distributes SSL traffic coming from the internet to virtual machine instances in your Google Cloud VPC network. So option C is correct for this scenario. Let's move ahead with the question 31. Your motorcycle company is going through a digitization phase. There are a lot of unstructured files in different file formats. ETL transformations on the data will be performed using cloud data flow. What should you do to make the data accessible on Google Cloud? These are the options available, and the correct answer is option B. Use the JSUtil command line tool to upload the data to cloud storage. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Let's take a look at option A. Use the BQ command line tool to upload the data to BigQuery. This option is incorrect because BigQuery only supports a limited number of structured file formats. The BQ command line tool is used to interact with BigQuery, and this is a data warehousing and analytics solution. It is not designed for uploading unstructured files or performing any ETL transformation. Now let's take a look at option B. Here option B is correct because cloud storage is object storage and it can store files of any type. The gsutil command line tool is used to interact with cloud storage, and this cloud storage is well suited for storing and accessing unstructured files. So by using JSUtil, you can upload the unstructured files to cloud storage and make them accessible on Google Cloud. Now let's take a look at option C. Option C is incorrect because here Cloud SQL only supports structured file formats. The import function in the console is used for uploading data into Cloud SQL, and this is a fully managed relational database service. So it is not specifically designed for handling unstructured files or performing any ETL related transformations. Now let's take a look at option D. Use the import function in the console to upload the data into Cloud Spanner. Here, Cloud Spanner can only store structured data. The import function in the console is used for uploading data into Cloud Spanner, which is a globally distributed, and it is strongly consistent with the relational database service. This cloud spanner is not designed for handling unstructured files or performing ETL transformation. So this option is not correct. So the correct option is option B. Now let's proceed with question 32. You are running a social media platform and compute engine. You cannot afford to lose any user data and you need to back up the VM's boot disk regularly. You also need to make sure the data can be restored quickly in case of a disaster. Older backups should be deleted automatically to save cost. What is the Google recommended approach for it? These are the options available. And the correct answer is option B. Create a snapshot schedule for the disk using the desired interval. Now let's take a look at each of these option. Option A. Create an instance template using a cloud function. Here, there is no need for a cloud function for regular backups. Creating an instance template using a cloud function will not directly address the requirement of backing up the VM's boot disk regularly and restoring the data quickly in case of a disaster. Instance templates and cloud functions, they both serve different purposes and do not provide the specific backup and restore functionalities which is required in this scenario. Now let's take a look at option B. Create a snapshot schedule for the disk using the desired interval. Here, snapshots and disk are independent objects in GCP. You could create a snapshot from the disk and then delete the disk and the snapshot will stay. And you can use this snapshot to create a new disk, assign to another VM, mount it and use it. So all the information that the original disk had at the time of the snapshot will still be there. Snapshots are the efficient way for backing up and restoring operations, and by using them, you can quickly restore the data in case of a disaster. So, option B is correct. Now, let's take a look at option C. Create a cron job to create a new disk from the disk using gcloud. Here, there is no need to create a cron job, and creating a cron job to create a new disk from the disk using the gcloud does not directly address the requirement of backing up the VM's boot disk regularly and restoring data quickly in case of a disaster. So, this approach involves manually creating new disks and it may not be efficient or suitable for regular backups and disaster recovery. So, option C is not correct. Now, let's take a look at option D. Use Cloud Task to create an image and export it to cloud storage. For this scenario, there is no need to create a cloud task. Using cloud task to create an image and export it to cloud storage is not the recommended approach for this scenario. And cloud task is a task queue service and it is primarily used for distributed task processing. So it is not designed specifically for disk backup and restore operations. For regular backups and data restoration, this option is not feasible. So option B is the correct one. Now let's proceed with the question 33. Your e-commerce web app is currently self-hosted. You realized that it takes lots of server and data maintenance on your part. As part of your company's plan to migrate the on-premise workload to Google Cloud, you have decided to migrate the development environments of a few non-critical applications first. The apps use Cassandra as their database. Cassandra instances for different apps need to be isolated from each other. How can you move them to Google Cloud quickly? These are the options available. And the correct answer is ask the developers to launch a Cassandra image for the development work using Google Cloud Marketplace. Now, let's take a look at each of these options. Let's take a look at option A. Write an instruction guide to install Cassandra on Google Cloud. Provide the instruction guide to your developers. This option is incorrect because creating a guide does not ensure that the effort will be minimum and the developers might not have experience working with infrastructure. So this option involves manually installing Cassandra on Google Cloud and it will be a time consuming and requires server and data maintenance. So this option doesn't go well with our scenario. Now let's take a look at option B. Ask the developers to launch a Cassandra image for the development work using Google Cloud Marketplace. This option is correct because launching Cassandra from the marketplace is the fastest and safest way. So this will allow the developers to quickly launch pre-configured Cassandra image from the Google Cloud Marketplace. By doing so, this will eliminate the need for manual installation and it also ensures that the Cassandra instances are properly set up. Now let's take a look at option C. Create a Cassandra compute engine instance and take its snapshot. Create instances for your developers using the snapshot. So this is a time consuming process and it is not the quickest way. It only creates a single Cassandra compute engine instance and it takes its snapshot. So this does not provide a way to isolate the Cassandra instances for different apps or migrate them to Google Cloud quickly. So this is a time consuming process. So this option is not the correct one. Now let's take a look at option D. Create a Cassandra compute engine instance and take its snapshot. Upload the snapshot to cloud storage and make it accessible to your developers. Write instructions to create a compute engine instance from the snapshot and ask the developers to do it themselves. Again, this option is time consuming. This involves creating a single Cassandra compute engine instance, also take a snapshot, upload the snapshot to cloud storage, and provide these instructions to the developers to create their own instance from the snapshot. So this entire process is a very lengthy and it's a time consuming, and it is not a straightforward way to isolate the Cassandra instances for different apps. So this option is not the correct one. For this scenario, option B is the best solution. Now let's proceed with the question 34. You work at a software solutions company and you have hosted your HRMS software on a general purpose compute engine instance. Your application is experiencing excessive disk read throttling on its zonal SSD persistent disk. The disk size is currently 350 GB. The application primarily reads large files from disk. How can you provide a maximum amount of throughput with an optimal cost? These are the options available. And the correct option is option C, use a local SSD on the instance instead. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Option A, increase the size of the disk to 1 TB. This option is not correct because increasing the disk size will improve the performance, but it will also increase the overall cost. So this is not the recommended way. So increasing the size of the disk may provide more storage space, but it will not address the performance issue. So this option is not correct. Now let's take a look at option B, increase the allocated CPU to the instance. This option is also not correct because by increasing the CPU allocation, it does not affect disk IO performance. Again, the issue is with the disk read throttling and not the CPU capacity. So increasing the CPU allocation may only help with the CPU intensive task, but it will not address the performance issue related to excessive disk read throttling. So this option is not correct. Now let's take a look at option C, use a local SSD on the instance instead. Here a local SSD has more input-output operations per second, and SSD persistent disks are designed for single-digit millisecond latencies. And these local SSDs are physically attached to the server that hosts your VM instance. Local SSDs have higher throughput and lower latency than standard persistent disk or SSD persistent disk. So switching to a local SSD makes it cheaper and faster. Adding CPUs will make it more expensive than the whole price. So option C is correct. Now let's take a look at option D. Use a regional SSD on the instance instead. Using a regional SSD on the instance will not address the excessive disk read throttling issue. Here, regional SSDs are network attached storage options that provide higher durability and availability, but it will not offer the same level of performance as local SSDs. Therefore, using a regional SSD may not provide the maximum amount of throughput which is required to optimize the cost and address the performance issue which is related to excessive disk read throttling. So option D is not correct. So the correct answer is option C. Now let's proceed with question 35. Your online multiplayer RPG game uses Cloud Spanner as its database to store, update, and retrieve player points. The game receives traffic in a very predictable manner. How can you automatically scale up and scale down the number of spanner nodes depending on traffic? These are the options available, and the correct answer is option D. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Let's take a look at option A. Create a cron job that runs periodically and reviews cloud monitoring metrics, then resizes the spanner instance accordingly. This option is not correct because this approach will not be able to dynamically scale the number of spanner nodes based on the real-time traffic. Using cron job, it can only manually resize based on the periodic metric reviews. So this option is not correct. Now let's take a look at option B. Create a cloud monitoring alerting policy that sends an email alert to the on-call SRE team when Cloud Spanner CPU exceeds the threshold. Ask the SREs to scale resources up or down accordingly. This option is not correct because here we have to involve the SRE team, which increases the manual effort required in scaling up and down. And since this process is repeatable, it should be automated. In this option, it also suggests creating a cloud monitoring alerting policy that sends an email alert to the on-call SRE team when Cloud Spanner CPU exceeds the threshold. This will require human intervention and it may result in delays in responding to the traffic changes. So option B is not correct. Now let's take a look at option C. Create a cloud monitoring alerting policy that sends an alert to Google Cloud Support email when Cloud Spanner CPU exceeds the threshold. Ask Google Support to scale resources up or down accordingly. This option is not correct because alerting Google Cloud Support will not do anything as you have to maintain your infrastructure yourself. So this approach will add additional steps and also have dependencies on the Google Cloud Support to manually scale the resources. So there will not be any immediate response to changing traffic patterns. So when you use this option, it will not offer any automated and immediate response to changing traffic patterns. Now let's take a look at option D. Create a cloud monitoring alerting policy that sends an alert to a webhook when the Cloud Spanner CPU is over or under the threshold. Create a cloud function that listens to HTTP and resizes spanner resources accordingly. This option is correct because this solution will enable real-time scaling by utilizing automation and also the capabilities of cloud function to respond to alerts and trigger resizing action. So by using this option, you will eliminate the need for manual intervention and also minimize the delays in scaling up or down based on the traffic changes. So this option D is the correct solution for this scenario. Now let's proceed with question 36. You are the head of data and security in a space research organization. Your company uses Active Directory Federation Service as a security assertion markup language identity provider and integrates it to perform single sign-on with supported service providers. Your company uses cloud identity for using GCP. What will you do to allow users to log into cloud identity using Active Directory credentials? These are the options available. And the correct answer is option B. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Let's take a look at option A. Set up SSO with Google as an identity provider in Cloud Identity to access custom SAML apps. Option A is not correct because Google needs to be an SSO service provider as a company already as an SSO identity provider. So these options suggest setting up SSO with Google as an identity provider in Cloud Identity to access custom SAML apps. However, in the question, it states that the company is using Active Directory Federation Service as its SAML identity provider and not Google. So, therefore, setting up SSO with Google will not allow users to log into cloud identity using the Active Directory credential. So, this option is not correct. Now, let's take a look at option B. Set up SSO with a third-party identity provider in Cloud Identity with Google as a service provider. Setting Google as the SSO service provider will enable users to log into their Google Suite account with their SSO credential. And this option suggests setting up SSO with a third-party identity provider in Cloud Identity and with Google as a service provider. So this option aligns with the scenario which is described in the question. Since the company is using Active Directory Federation Service as its SAML identity provider, by setting up SSO with a third-party identity provider such as Active Directory and configuring Google as a service provider, users will be able to log into Cloud Identity using their Active Directory credential. So option B is correct. Now let's take a look at option C. Obtain OAuth 2.0 credentials, configure the user consent screen, set up OAuth 2.0 for mobile and desktop apps. This option is not correct because OAuth 2 is not the right protocol for this. It suggests obtaining OAuth 2.0 credentials and configuring the user consent screen for mobile and desktop apps. However, in the question, it does not mention about the need for OAuth 2.0 credentials or the use of mobile and desktop apps. So this option is not relevant for this scenario. Now let's take a look at option D. Obtain OAuth 2.0 credential, configure the user consent screen, set up OAuth 2.0 for web server application. This option is also incorrect because here OAuth2 is not the right protocol for this as discussed in the option C. Here also it suggests obtaining OAuth 2.0 credential and configuring the user consent screen for web server application. So this is similar to option C. This option does not align with the scenario which is described in the question. So option D is not the correct one. So the correct answer is option B. Now let's proceed with question 37. One of your machine learning pipelines at your AI services company uses Dataproc. The Dataproc cluster runs in a single VPC network in a single subnet with range 10.0.2.0/25. The VPC network does not have any more private IP addresses left. You need to add a few more VMs to communicate with the cluster. How can you do it with a minimum number of steps? These are the options available, and the correct answer is option A. Modify the existing subnet range to 10.0.2.0/24. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Modify the existing subnet range to 10.0.2.0/24. This option is correct because it is possible to increase the IP range of a subnet after creation. Using this option, we can expand the available IP address range within the same VPC network. So by modifying the subnet range from 25 to 24, the subnet size will be increased. This will allow for more IP addresses to be assigned, and this can be done without the need to create additional VPC networks or establish VPC peering. So option A is correct. Now let's take a look at option B. Add a new secondary IP range in the VPC. Configure the VMs to use that range. This option is not correct because here subnets can be expanded in size and there is no need to create a new subnet for this. And adding a new secondary IP range in the VPC and configuring the VMs to use that range will not solve the problem of running out of available private IP addresses in the subnet. The secondary IP range is used to assign additional IP addresses to existing VM instances within the same subnet, but it does not increase the total number of available private IP addresses in the subnet. So option B is not correct. Now let's take a look at option C. Create a new VPC network, provision the VMs in the new VPC, enable VPC peering between the new VPC network and the Dataproc cluster VPC network. This option is not correct because there is no need to create a separate VPC for the VMs, and creating a new VPC network and provisioning the VMs in the new VPC network will require setting up VPC pairing between the new VPC network and the existing Dataproc cluster VPC network. So this will again require additional configuration and steps which is not necessary to solve the problem of running out of available private IP addresses in the existing VPC network subnet. Now let's take a look at option D. Create a new VPC network for the VMs with a subnet of 10.0.2.0/16. Enable VPC network peering between the Dataproc VPC network and the VM's VPC network. Configure a custom route exchange. This option is incorrect because there is no need to create a separate VPC, and creating a new VPC network for the VMs with a subnet of 10.0.2.0/16 will result in a much larger address range than needed. So this will consume more IP addresses than necessary, and it could potentially lead to IP address wastage. Also, VPC network peering and custom route exchange will add complexity and additional steps which is not needed to solve this problem. So option A is the best solution for this scenario. Now let's proceed with question 38. Your company sells beauty products globally via a web-based application. You have recently started using the Google Cloud platform. You downloaded and installed the gcloud command line interface and authenticated it with your Google account. There are several compute engine instances in your GCP projects that you want to manage through the command line. The instances are located in the Europe West 1 region. How can you avoid having to specify the zone with each CLI command when managing these instances? These are the options available, and the correct answer is option A. Use the gcloud config subcommand to set the Europe West 1-D zone as the default zone. Now let's take a look at each of these options. Let's take a look at option A. Use the gcloud config subcommand to set the Europe West 1-D zone as the default zone. This option is correct because here setting the default zone will enable gcloud to use the same zone for all the gcloud services, and we don't have to specify it every time a command is run. gcloud config subcommand allows you to set various configurations for the gcloud CLI tool. So by using this command gcloud config set compute zone Europe-West 1-D, you can set the Europe West 1-D zone as the default zone for all the CLI commands. So this way you don't have to specify the zone with each command when managing instances. So this will save the time and the effort. So option A is correct. Now let's take a look at option B. Go to the settings page for compute engine and set the zone to Europe West 1-D under default location. This option is not correct because changing the settings in the GCP console will not affect the gcloud command line tool. So the question is specific to gcloud command line tool. And the settings page for compute engine does not have an option to set the default zone. Here we can configure the default project, enable APIs, manage SSH keys and customize quota, but there is no option to set the default zone. So option B is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option C. Create a file called default.conf in the CLI installation directory. The file contains the text zone is equal to Europe-West1-D. This option is also incorrect because the default zone is set through the command line and there is no such functionality in the gcloud CLI tool to create a default.conf file in the installation directory. So this option is not available, and the gcloud CLI tool primarily relies on the configuration which is set through the gcloud config command. So option C is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option D. Create a metadata entry on the compute engine page with key, compute zone and value Europe West 1-D. This option is not correct because changing the compute engine metadata will not change the gcloud command line config. And metadata entries are primarily used to add custom key value pairs to instances for different purposes, but they do not override the default zone which is used on the gcloud CLI tool. So even if you create a metadata entry on the compute engine page with key compute zone, it will not affect the CLI commands. So this option is not correct. So the correct option for this scenario is option A. Now let's proceed with question 39. Your company is a well-reputed firm in the food delivery sector. Your company has hosted its web and mobile applications on GCP. You are responsible for managing GCP costs for your organization. You have identified that a certain division of your company has several services configured, but they are not using them. What should you do to turn off all configured services in the GCP project? These are the options available, and the correct answer is option A. Now let's take a look at each of these options and understand why option A is correct. Let's take a look at option A. Make sure you have the project owner IAM role for this project. Navigate to the project in the GCP console, click shutdown and then enter the project ID. This option is correct because an owner of the GCP project can shut down it. The project owner IAM role for the project is required. So this will add the necessary permissions to that user to navigate to the project in the GCP console and shut down that project. And when shutting down the project, they should enter the project ID to confirm the shutdown. So if you want to turn off the configured services in the GCP project, these are the process which you need to follow. So the option A is correct. Now let's take a look at option B. Make sure you have the project owner IAM role for this project. Navigate to the project in the GCP console, locate the resources and delete them. This option is not correct because this requires manually locating and deleting the resources, and it can be error prone and a time consuming process. In this option, it also suggests deleting the resources instead of shutting them down. So deleting the resources will permanently remove them from the project and it may result in loss of data or configurations. This option is not feasible in this scenario where the services are not currently being used. So option B is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option C. Make sure you have the organizational administrator IAM role for this project. Navigate to the project in the GCP console, enter the project ID and then click shutdown. Organizational administrator IAM role is not required for shutting down configured services. Option C is incorrect. Now let's take a look at option D. Make sure that you have the organizational administrator IAM role for this project. Navigate to the project in the GCP console, locate the resources and delete them. This option is similar to option B. There is no need for an organization admin role for this. In the question, the main objective is to turn off configured services rather than permanently removing them. And this option suggests to delete the resources, but in the question they just want to turn off the services. So option A is the best solution for this scenario. Let's proceed with question 40. You are part of the Google Cloud operations team at the digital vertical of your retail stores chain. You are managing multiple projects. How can you configure the Google Cloud SDK to easily manage multiple projects? These are the options available, and the correct answer is option A. Now, let's take a look at each of these options. Let's take a look at option A. Make a separate configuration for each project you need to manage. Activate the appropriate configuration for each of your assigned Google Cloud projects as required. This option is correct because it is considered the best practice to create separate configurations for separate projects and switch between them as needed. So this will allow for better organization and separation of settings for each project. So each project will have separate settings. So by activating the appropriate configuration for each assigned project, it will ensure that the correct settings are used when working on a specific project. So option A is correct. Now let's take a look at option B. Make a separate configuration for each project you need to manage. Update the configuration values using gcloud init whenever you need to work with a non-default project. This option is not correct because if the configurations are created, then you don't need to run gcloud init to switch to a different config. So this method can be time consuming and inefficient when managing multiple projects since it requires manually updating configurations each time. So this option is not correct. Now let's take a look at option C. Use the default configuration for one project you need to manage. Activate the appropriate configuration for each of your assigned Google Cloud projects as required. This option is not correct because it's always considered best practice to create separate configuration for separate projects and switch between them as needed. This option also suggests to use the default configuration for one project that needs to be managed, and this might lead to confusion and potential errors when working on multiple projects as the default configuration may not have the correct settings for each project. So it is always better to create separate configuration for each project. Now let's take a look at option D. Use the default configuration for one project you need to manage. Update the configuration values using gcloud init whenever you need to work with a non-default project. So this method is similar to option B. This also requires manual updating of configurations each time a different project needs to be worked on. So it's always a best practice to have a separate configuration for each project. For this scenario, option A is correct. So that's it for today's video. We have completed module 2. I hope you found this video helpful. Please like and subscribe to my channel and stay up to date with the latest content on this channel. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all for watching. See you in the next video.